Inclusive leadership, it focuses on creating an environment where all individuals feel valued. You never leave a room without a business card, a firm handshake, and I'll follow up with you. Finding a mentor would be, as far as advice to someone in healthcare management, would be my number one. Remaining adaptable would be number two.
Be confident, be articulate, know your audience, prepare.
Because when you have a great team, you can do amazing things.
So it's good to kind of keep that circle going where you kind of mentor people, but then they become leaders themselves.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse, your home for all things management and finance. I'm your host, Alex Ponce. Our special guest today is Dr. Scott Phillips. He's a subject matter expert in healthcare management, military medicine, and leadership development. He has studied at such institutions as Florida International University, Johns Hopkins, and the University of New Orleans, where he is also an assistant professor of healthcare management. His research has included such topics as workplace stigma and mental health care literacy in job performance. Apart from his career in the military, where he earned the Distinguished Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, he most recently served as a market development manager with Humana and now is a consultant with Aptive Resources. Thank you, Dr. Phillips, for taking the time out of your busy schedule and joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I switched over to phone audio, so I do hope you can hear me okay.
We can hear you okay. It just sounds like you're climbing Mount Everest and you're phoning in on a satellite phone, but it's perfect. We can hear you perfectly. How are you doing? Everything well?
Doing great. I like to stay high-tech, Alex, so I'm glad to hear him on my sat phone.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, tell me about where you're currently at. I know that you're a consultant with Aptive. What exactly does that entail? What exactly are you doing with them? And what do they do?
Aptive Resources focuses on a Veterans Experience Council, which is where my current role is. I've been with them now for, I would say, approaching a year, but they, generally speaking, contract with the government and the Veterans Affairs. Therefore, they reach out to sort of have a peer review or a peer network, if you will, of veterans and military resources. Actually,
quite practical. I'm glad that such a service actually exists. I appreciate that. So you're right now a consultant with them. And in your capacity as a consultant, how does it work? Because there's so many different kinds of consultants. And I know that many people that are working on their degrees right now, in management in particular, are focusing on consulting space. So how is your dynamic with the company? Or do you have a team of direct reports? Are you strategizing? What exactly is it that you do?
No, I actually work for them. They come to us with projects that they're involved in, anywhere between 6-month projects to long-term projects with the VA. And we take a look at the operations capacities. Sometimes we take a look at the from a surveying standpoint, we may answer questions about the project from an end user's categorization and also from an operations perspective.
I fully understand. So from the moment that you receive one of these project proposals to the time that you start working on them, is there like a typical turnaround time of a few weeks to a few months, or is this something that's a multi-year project?
So far from what I've done, it's been a couple months or a couple weeks to months ad hoc projects.
Okay, so they're not wasting any time. They want you on the ground running then.
Yeah, these are contracts that they've worked on with the government, generally speaking, for a length of time to put in play. They're spearheading and really holding the charge on the operations side. They lean on the Veterans Experience Council for the input on what may or may not work, form over function.
And in your role, and I say it's recent because it's only been in the last few years, but what has been the predominant trend that you've seen as far as concerns? Because, every industry, including the one that you're dealing with right now, has certain trends that every other request is this, whatever this may be. And what have you experienced being the predominant issue that keeps popping up from your point of view?
For the projects that I've been involved with, mainly with the Veterans Health Affairs of the VA, it's been mental health and physical health predominantly.
I understand. Your expertise definitely deals with mental health. And I'm astounded because I see your background. I mean, you have a doctorate in business administration from the #2 ranked school for international business. You have a Juris Master degree, which gives you a speciality from a non-court individual that studied at a college of law in order to understand? I guess you went for the concentration of healthcare?
Ironically, I did not. It was not offered at the time. I came on board with one of the first cohorts at the Juris Masters and was hoping for the healthcare focus, which was just recently added, I believe, within the last year or two. So mine is actually in banking compliance. I saw some waning legislation in the healthcare world at the time. I was moving on from my fellowship with the VA and looking for a career route, and noticed new law in the banking compliance world. So I went on to get the Juris Masters actually in banking. I was in Miami at the time, right there in the belly of the beast of the financial district, and looked at it as a career opportunity. As you know, I moved on to the DBA and rerouted back to the healthcare world a couple of years later.
I mean, that is amazing, the coincidence. Here you are, perfectly suited for the healthcare concentration, but it just happened to not be available at the time. But one way or the other, you were going to make it happen. Now that you have a banking knowledge as far as the law is concerned and how to interact with it, have you been able to employ it in your current situation? Because I would imagine that apart from the specialized courses, you get so much foundational as far as the Juris Master that you could pretty much go in any direction. How has that been working out for you thus far? Because I know some people have been interested in that particular degree.
That's correct, Alex. So the first, I believe, 6 courses of the program focus on torts, contracts, the history of American law, business contracts, analytical writing, law writing. So you have the foundation just as you would if you did a Juris Doctorate. You just don't go into the specialty courses, so you're not going to be barred, obviously. And then depending on what specialization you land on, be it banking, be it healthcare, they also have an educational program at FIU. Then obviously you'll capture between 3 and another 5 courses in that specialty. But to answer your question, have I used it? Most definitely. The foundational law classes can be applied anywhere in the world of business. And I find that I use them almost daily. Additionally, I use them in my teachings, obviously, at UNO. We're an AACSB accredited and AUHPA accredited, the only dual accredited program in Louisiana and Mississippi, actually. But we tend to lean toward as much breadth of knowledge as we can with our students. So in my Monday night course, which is our healthcare reimbursements course, I tend to lean on a little bit of that law knowledge and show the overlaps between the finance and the legal aspects.
You're definitely making the region proud. I don't even know where to start with you. Most people have a very direct path, how to interview them, but there's so many different angles because there's so much material here to work with. So let me just start at the beginning. I mean, you graduated from high school. You have the world in front of you. What was your first step? Did you immediately go into the military, or did you first go and work on your bachelor's before going into the military?
That's actually correct. I did my bachelor's at the University of South Alabama as a student athlete. I was a track and field athlete, junior Olympian in high school, and went on to run in college, or I should say jump in college. And, I started my healthcare journey there. My undergraduate is in health sciences. I did a dual internship at Providence Hospital in Mobile, Alabama, where I did clinical cardiac rehab and adult wellness, along with an administrative effort as well. So I had 250-hour internships on both sides, clinically and administratively.
Wow.
From there, I moved up to Minnesota, where I worked in my first professional realm as a medical staffer, medical recruiter and staffer for a company out of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And from there, I moved into medical device for a few years, conquered a 5-state territory of North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. So I got to see the flat land and cold tundra of America.
That's a tough region. That is a tough region. To be behind the windshield of 8 months out of the year is pretty tough. So, moved on from there and actually went back to school in, what was that, right around 2005, and started in public administration at South Alabama as an assistant coach. And then Hurricane Katrina hit and wiped out the entire Gulf Coast, as we know. Mm-hmm. And that's when I decided to join the military. I was looking for something firm to set my feet on. I am a legacy military brat. I was born in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. My father was a major in the Army, and my grandfather was a captain in the Coast Guard. So I come by it honestly. My mother said she was surprised I didn't wear a uniform earlier.
But I signed up late in life. I was 26 going on 27 when I enlisted in the military.
Wow.
So put a good run in. I spent 13 years, went overseas for 3, traveled around the world and got to see most of Europe and some small portions of Eastern and Western Europe. Worked at a hospital in Germany called Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, which is where we send all of our medevacs, aeromedical evacuation casualties from Afghanistan and Iraq. So saw about 10,971 casualties, that's real numbers, in 3 years, and learned a lot about patient triage and medical management and movement, patient movement itself. Just about anything you think of from an administrative standpoint in a hospital, we got to touch.
Yeah, but I venture a guess that there's no such thing as just an administrator when you're dealing with the military. Everybody wears a hat, and then there's the 10 other hats that you have to wear as well to make do, because you're all one team. So let me ask you before we break forward, one of the concerns with this series has been with leadership, has been with managing yourself and managing others. And what are the methods that you've used in doing so? Now, I understand that, of course, the military is world renowned for teaching leadership in various ways because, well, it's a way of life. If you can't follow orders and if you can't motivate your troops and you can't motivate your colleagues, it does kind of put you in a predicament. And so I wanted to know, at this very point in your career, you already have quite a bit of experience under your belt, and now you're applying it in a military context, in a venue that's appropriate for this. What has been your, I don't want to say calling card, but your go-to when you're dealing with leadership issues, when you're managing individuals, for example, a difficult individual or difficult situation? How do you always approach it? Like, what's your thought process behind how you approach these issues or scenarios?
You know, I would have to say a little bit of empathy and a lot of resilience. You know, in today's multicultural and multi-generational environments, be it the military or healthcare, you know, I find that if you don't understand the people you're working with, it's really hard to lead them. And so you have to come at it with an open mind, and you have to face each challenge as it's unique, you know, putting the challenges away and making them more opportunities of learning. So, you know, a breadth of knowledge is great and experience is paramount, but understanding where your peers are coming from and where that team that you work with is coming from really is how I approach it.
You know what? It's funny that you say the word empathy, because that has been the running theme. Almost every single individual that I've had the honor and pleasure to interview, that seems to be a default word, because like they say, you know, how can I understand what's going on if I don't understand the individual? And you have to be open to understanding in order to accomplish the goals that you're trying to do so. And at the same time, foster a good working relationship, whether it's a client or a colleague or a subordinate, whoever they may be. But you also said resilience. That's interesting. I think you're the first person to bring that up. So tell me how resilience plays in these work environments, especially ones as difficult as the ones that you've been a part of.
Sure. And what you said is just right on the spot, you know, Alex. In the military where, you know, teamwork and discipline are paramount, we learn those early on. And when I say we, you know, my military brethren and uniform members, we learn teamwork and discipline in boot camp. And no matter which branch of service you're in, you know, we all come about it, generally speaking, the same way. And it instills a set of values in you that stick with you for life. But the empathy piece and the resilience piece that you're asking about aren't always there. You know, you may have an individual who wants to do things the way they were trained or the way that they see things today. So your resilience is required because every time you face any type of strife in life, you need to be able to rebound from it and learn from it. So that resilience factor, I find, is essential, especially in the healthcare realm, because if we're dealing with a clinical capacity, then we're going to see some pretty ugly things, especially in military medicine. You know, I talked about those casualties, and you can only imagine the things we see. But I tell people, you know, you see everything from a stub toe to a gunshot wound to the head. And that's a pretty broad spectrum. The same goes for the administrative channels. You know, you're dealing with an array of backgrounds. So you may have a high school teacher. I had a chief petty officer who was my principal manager, and he was a high school teacher. Not a whole lot of healthcare management going on in his life outside of his time in the military. Well, in the military, he was the lead administrator. He was there to make sure the tasks were done and done effectively. So, he had to have that humility and empathy that we talked about in order to work with those of us who had healthcare backgrounds. But at the same time, he had to be resilient. He had to be able to take each day as a new day and bounce off of other people and echo what's needed to move forward.
I fully appreciate that. In the organizational behavior space, there's a lot of focus on learning the 5 or so main leadership styles. And this is applicable whether you're in human resources or in sales or wherever. But it does seem that people tend to default to an authoritarian style, which is usually reserved for immediate emergency, do this right now because I'm telling you to kind of scenario. That almost rarely ever happens unless, again, you're experiencing someone with a gunshot wound. What tends to be your strategy? Because there's so many new ones that are coming out as well. Transformative, for example. What seems to be, or transactional, what seems to be the one that works, in your opinion, best in the healthcare sector in non-emergency scenarios?
I would honestly say inclusive leadership.
Okay.
Recognizing the diverse nature of not only healthcare teams, but the patients that we're seeing. Today you're going to hear a lot on diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of my studies is in that realm. But inclusive leadership, it focuses on creating an environment where all individuals feel valued. And I find that, especially in the region that I'm in, and I've even seen it at the VA during my fellowship time and as a patient for the past, 10 years now. That inclusive leadership is vital, because the frontline staff, making $8 to $12 an hour may not feel like they're really part of the team when they find out their administrators are, GS-12s to GS-14s making 109 to 140. So it's kind of hard to motivate sometimes on different factors. So, that can contribute fully to an understanding of your team. The overall approach is key to promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I really find that inclusive leadership is vital today.
Now, that happens to be one of the subjects of your research, which I mentioned at the top of the show. Tell me a little bit about this research. I know we're flashing forward a bit, but tell me a little bit about this research, because, you're hitting on some hot button issues in the world of management and finance. These are the topics that are being talked about right now, and makes sense. You're a professor yourself at the University of New Orleans, but tell me how this research came about and why you felt it was important enough to investigate as a primary investigator, actually.
Well, it actually came about during my time at Humana. Humana has a big DEI culture, and it exposed me to it from not only an academic sense while I was at Johns Hopkins, studying, population health in their public health school, Bloomberg School. But, I found that it seemed to be vital in creating back to the word empathy, a more empathetic and effective healthcare environment. So the study itself is based on, the application of DEI initiatives in the workplace and the effects on outcomes, not only from a patient outcome, but from a managerial outcome. I find that these initiatives benefit employees by fostering that sense of belonging that we talked about. And the study survey will be launched officially here probably the second week of January. I have a wonderful cohort that I'm working with, one professor from UNO, and then one of my DBA brothers, Mr. Hydrich Vici, and then also one of the local administrators from a long-term care center here in New Orleans. So we're seeking out any peers out there that are interested in the study, that have applied DEI or are thinking about it. We'd be more than happy to send the survey your way here in the future.
Now, obviously, your success is rooted in part due to your natural or innate ability to network, because Little Bird told me that you're very good at connecting people and almost being a matchmaker. So if we could just talk a little bit about that as well. I mean, what's your approach to networking? I mean, when you hear the word networking, what are your thoughts? What's your approach? What's your dissertation, if it were, on networking and how important it is to your career?
Sure. I'm very fortunate. I learned that at a very young age. My stepfather actually, was a outside salesman by trade, but came from the operating room at Tulane Hospital. He was the charge nurse of the orthopedic OR. And he was recruited because of his relationships and his ability to build and keep those relationships. And it's something he taught me at a young age. He said, back in the day when we had regular business cards, he said, son, if you ever get the opportunity, never leave a room without a business card, a firm handshake, and I'll follow up with you. So I've used that throughout my career, from mentorship, seeking out mentors, to, utilizing it for just general friendship. I find that, you can learn so much from a 2-minute conversation if you really apply some thought to it. So, shaking a hand, getting a business card, or today, pulling your cell phone out and getting someone's cell phone number, or using Linktree or any of those, fabulous apps that are out there that link us up together. You're right. I do make an extra effort to do that and to share that mindset, not only with my students, but with my peers as well.
Are you protective of your connections, or are you open? And I only ask this because people tend to have two different modes when they're on networking apps. One is they try to connect with as many people as they can, whether they know them or not. And the other ones are quite selective, as in to say, if you know what's going on in my life because you're reading it on my profile, it's because you're important to me. And if you don't see that, it's because you're on the outside. Two different approaches. They have two different goals in mind. What's your approach?
That's an interesting question. I'm a big fan of Buckingham and Clifton. Find your strengths and know your strengths, and the strength finders. And one of my top 5 is relational. And what that actually means is kind of counterintuitive to what you would think it is. It's not that I'm out there trying to make relationships with everyone. It's that I safeguard my relationships, and I often keep them, at a distance from other people. So to answer your question directly, that would be who I am by trade. I value my relationships, and I do want to make as many as I can, but I keep those that are, endearing and earnest to me, often very safeguarded, because I trust and value them. I've got some great friends, your wife included, Lyria, Dr. LaJoyo, Tony LaJoyo, some network individuals, Ranjit, who I've networked with and kept in contact with quite a bit since school. Those relationships you feel you can call upon at any time, and that's great to have. And I tell people that even in my military days, there's probably not a state in the country that I can't make a phone call and have a sofa to sleep on if I'm passing through. And, that's just the type of endearing relationship I try to maintain.
Now, the ultimate expression of having these relationships is a mentor. A lot of our viewers either have mentors, they are a mentor, they have a mentor. And I wanted to know what your opinion of it is, because obviously we've all heard the expression, it takes a village, and no one is a success on their own. But there are some relationships that are closer, in which, almost like an apprentice, you're emulating, you're learning from them very intimately in order to pass on that knowledge, which is difficult to do just by saying a few quips and reading a few chapters. I mean, that really is a one-on-one relationship. What's your feeling on mentorship and what you're looking for in mentors when you are seeking them out for whatever the thing is that you're seeking them out for?
I think it's vital. It's vital in self-actualization, in self-development, to have a soundboard, no matter what it is. If it's a mentor, if it's a professional, psychiatrist or psychologist, they're there for a reason. Social workers, they're there for a reason. I tell my veteran peers, if you don't seek out those opportunities when you come through transition, you're really selling yourself short. Finding a mentor would be, as far as advice to someone in healthcare management, would be my number one. Remaining adaptable would be number 2, because you're not always going to hear what you want to hear. Hopefully you hear what you need to hear. And mentors are there to be, sounding boards, but also to be directional and to let you know, where you can grow and where you have opportunity to create strength. Continuously seeking knowledge is not just doing it through erudition, not just doing it through reading books or going to school and having all these wonderful accolades and certificates. That doesn't mean a whole lot if you don't have your own self-actualization and your own, internal desire for knowledge. And I find that we learn more from each other than we could ever learn in books.
I couldn't agree with you more. Do you find from individuals that you've worked with, whether in the past in a sales capacity or in your military career or now, which is more in the consulting space, do you see a recurring theme with the individuals that, for example, apply to work with you, that if you could just sit them down and give them a top 5 list of things that they should work on, what would those things be? I ask because I have a lot of people that either have no work experience and are working towards their degree so that they can start, or they've worked in one industry and they've decided to pivot. And in order to pivot, they want to have the paper in order to, the credential in order to justify the pivot. But for all intents and purposes, they're kind of starting from scratch again. So what are the things that you see as, I don't want to call them problem areas, but deficits, things that require some sort of attention in order to improve?
Sure. And I'll draw upon my current academic environment for, what I've just had, which is my first semester, my first true semester as an assistant professor. Telling your story is really vital in the professional world. Knowing who you are, but more importantly, who you desire to be. Where is your path going to take you? Do you have that 3-year, 5-year, 10-year plan? And if not, why? If you can't tell me where you want to go, it's real difficult as a mentor, an employer, or even just a friend to give you any kind of advice, because then I'm just kind of shooting for the stars on what's going to click and what isn't. So, having that meaningful desire and that passion for something, what is it that wakes you up in the morning and has you strap your boots on and go out and face the world? There's an old saying, you can take a few black eyes in your life and you'll have a smile forever. And that's true to term if you have focus. So I would say definitely, knowing what you want to do, knowing who you are, having focus on something, no matter where we are in our careers. Perhaps you had a bad year fiscally, in the finance world, so you have to make some adjustments to your everyday lifestyle. Everybody today is struggling with finances because of what's going on in the world. So how do I make that adjustment and not hinder the lifestyle that I'm used to for my family and myself? Whether or not it's in academics, did you have a bad semester? Perhaps you didn't put enough time and effort into a specific class. So, all that being said, my second most would be time management, understanding what you're good at and what you're not, and being able to align that with your daily and weekly activities. And then I would say the third most important for me is, knowing that you're a small part of the world, but being part of something that's bigger than you are, being part of something bigger than yourself. You, Alex, are taking charge in this program and running it down on Pulse and making this effort so others can come and learn together and hear these wonderful speeches. But, I would have to ask you, is it for your own good? No, it's for the betterment of others. So, being humble and realizing you can be part of something bigger than yourself. Those would be my top three.
Well, when I get compliments like that, it's kind of hard to be humble. But yeah, I definitely want to help everybody. I find that, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but for example, I find that a lot of people need help with their presentation skills. They are wonderful. You could talk to them at lunch ad nauseum. Yet you put a camera in front of them, or they have to give some sort of report or briefing to a group of their colleagues. They freeze up. They cannot put a sentence together to save their lives. Has that been your experience as well, that presentation skills is also something that should be worked on, or did you find that in the healthcare field it's not really applicable?
I find it's a mixed bag. Again, drawing upon my recent experiences, I challenge my courses from sophomore level all the way through senior level to give presentations. I'm going to watch 3 of them this evening on research proposals. Earlier last month, I had a class of 24 students who gave not only individual presentations, but group presentations. Some people speak well in groups, others speak well by themselves, but you need to learn to do both. So I encourage anyone, every time you get a chance to get in front of a camera or a microphone, take it, because you'll learn something from it each time. As you could probably tell, I'm a very verbose individual. I can speak a lot in a lot of different ways, and I've had to hone that over many years and learn how to, taper it back when needed. But to answer your question directly, without a doubt, presentation of self and presentation among others is vital in the business capacity. So to answer your question, yes.
I wouldn't say verbose. My grandmother would say you're just right. You're able to communicate your thoughts, and communication is the cornerstone of any relationship, which brings up another interesting point. You've had the, I would say, good fortune of being involved in many different industries that have many different divisions and sectors and locations. And the bigger an organization is, the more predisposed they are to the silo effect. How have you seen the silo effect affect the healthcare industry? And more importantly, what would you tell colleagues that perhaps are new to the field? What are some tips, tactics that they can use in order to overcome the negative effects? I mean, I've heard all sorts of horror stories, Debbie in accounting, you can't talk to her because, the supervisor kind of blocks off the emails, or someone in sales doesn't return reports at time. What are the tactics that you've used the few times, I would imagine, that you've had to directly encounter the silo effect?
I think you have to incorporate a little bit of transactional and a whole lot of transformational. The transactions that you have day to day, like you just spoke about, Betty in accounting or finance, you can't get a hold of her. You can't let that be your last effort. We're only as good as our last performance, sure. But if we give up at that last one and we don't learn from it, then what are we really doing, right? In healthcare, you're going to have that. You're going to have transaction to transaction to transaction, and that's part of, the business. But being transformational and really promoting a culture of continuous improvement and adaptation is vital. I've been looking at this thing in healthcare for about 30 years now, and I remember back when the PPOs and HMOs first came around, and I went to a place called Carousel Pediatrics right here in Louisiana as a kid. And, I remember how you interacted with the front desk, and it was just such a wonderful time. They literally had a carousel inside the office for the kids, and, we like to play and have a good time. And then you go to the back and you get your immunizations and you get poked and prodded and not so much like the doctor part of it, right? And I was, as a kid, that's what I remembered about healthcare. Then you move on to the years later and you're struggling to see a physician for longer than 8 minutes in a room. So, as we have continuous improvement efforts, as we try to get back to some of the things of the past, it's important to realize that each transaction has a memory for someone, and, you can always improve on that. So, those would be the points that I would really focus on the most.
How do you reconcile the almost contradictory positions where you may have a healthcare provider that wants to give 100%, all their time, all their energy, all their effort to a patient? And then you have the investors that are putting pressure on administrators to minimize the amount of time spent per patient so that they can see more patients. So it's an efficiency versus quality issue. If we were to look at it from a factory point of view, how are administrators balancing those two things? Because the investor side is just looking at the numbers. The healthcare provider is just looking at the quality of their service. And as an administrator, you're kind of stuck in the middle. So how do you do that balancing act?
I like to say emotional intelligence, something everybody can work on, be it in your personal relationships at home or especially in the work environment. Understanding that as a leader, no matter where you are, and leadership is not, from the top, leadership is a person in a place and position. Does it come from the top most frequently in healthcare? Sure. But today's development is cultivating leaders that are bottom up. So, emotional intelligence, I find, is really something that is of all the focuses or foci that we talked about, the continuous improvement, the value creation, and especially, the differences in what you're describing, which is the difference in theories. Today's complexities of healthcare from a leadership perspective are, vast and many. So understanding what environment you're in, the way that I would answer that question while I'm working at the VA versus the way that I would answer that question 15 years ago when I was working in a private neurology clinic would be two very different things. At the VA, multicultural, siloed, but has the same patient-centered goal from facility to facility. At the independent neurology clinic, very family-oriented, physician-driven, patient-centered environment. So knowing where you are and understanding the complexity of healthcare systems is going to be vital there.
No, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, different settings have different requirements. And of course, there's the evolution of Scott Phillips. The Scott Phillips of 20 years ago is not the one of today. That brings up an interesting point. When you were dealing on the sales side of things, I guess pre-military, in a very, very, very tough region, And I just keep saying that because I just keep thinking of all my trips into that area. And I'm like, this is tough. There's no words to describe it other than tough. It's a tough situation. How did you approach sales? Were you in a leadership position there? Were you a subordinate? Because I know that nowadays the thinking is we're all leaders in our own way. But in a sales department, you're pretty much beholden to quotas and to, the team dynamic that's in place. Every team dynamic is different. What was your experience in the sales world?
So to answer your first question, I was in fact a subordinate. I was a territory manager, so I oversaw a 5-state territory. But I had a regional manager, of course, and a hierarchy throughout the company, all the way up to the VP of sales. It was a team environment because our quotas, of course, were scaled and adjusted by the regions. So, our monthly goals versus our year-to-date goals were adjusted based on the sales aggregates from the team. But at the same time, I like to say I was a leader. I was consulting. I don't like to say selling, but consulting primary care physicians on urologic device and the contraindications of those anticholinergic medications that were out at the time. Big push, if you remember, gotta go right now. The old Flomax commercial. I don't know if that rings a bell.
Absolutely.
But there's a huge push for anticholinergics among the traditionalist population at the time. And what we learned was that one of the contraindications was bladder post-void residuals. So the diagnostic device that I was selling came with a consultation of just that. Are your patients being treated for? Have you seen? And if not, why? So leading a physician to understand that even though they're diagnosing a condition and treating it with a drug, that may be all fine and well, but that they need to understand what the contraindications are of those medications and look for other things. So that's hard to do at 24. So most of the physicians in the Midwest, if you don't know, average about age 58. So I was literally half the age of most of the people there. I would walk into an office and do your typical salesman, look around and look at the degrees and look at the pictures of their kids and their family vacation photos and that kind of thing to spark conversation. And in that 2-minute obligatory would learn that most of them were my dad's age or older. So, telling them how to do something or consulting them on what to do was challenging. But you have to, as any leader does, be flexible, be fair, but be firm, and realize that how these technologies enhance patient care and the operational efficiency is really what you're looking to do. You're not looking to make a sale to put money in your pocket. We're at the end of the day, we're both looking to better the patient outcome.
It's funny because this loops into something that was talked about before, which is empathy. You have to understand who you're dealing with in order to see how best you can assist them. And this is the salesman's dilemma. There was a time, very 1950s, door-to-door salesman. They don't care whether you need it or not. They're just going to keep pushing their product. Nowadays, you have the same position are now called solution consultants because they're basically consulting you in order to find out if they can come up with a solution to a problem you have, which then pushes the salesman to look at everything in terms of a problem so that they can see which of their solutions fits. How do you balance those two? Because at the end of the day, the salesperson has to make a sale. Otherwise, departments start closing. And yet at the same time, the salesperson has to empathize with the individual in order to figure out what's the right fit. Because they could have all the software or products in the world, but if it's not going to make a dent to this individual, that's a hard sell. So how, as a salesperson, especially at the time you were so young, how did you deal with that contradiction? Because sometimes some of these doctors, I imagine, had no use for the product.
Well, I would like to think, if I had to put a word on it back then, assessment and feedback. Knowing your audience, finding out who that individual is. Are they an interdisciplinary learner? Are they a self-directed learner? You can look on the wall and see if they've had their recent, accreditations, if they're board certified, et cetera. That'll give you a little bit of an indication from a consulting standpoint whether or not, this is going to be an assessment type situation where they're going to look at the product and think it over, or whether or not this is just going to be a feedback session where we're going to bounce some questions and answers off each other.
That's very practical advice. A lot of people go into these sales situations not fully having a strategy how to do it. And that's a very insightful way of approaching the problem, which is try to discern what kind of individual you're selling to so that you know which approach to take. That's very interesting. So you have your private career, you go into the military, now you're in private practice again. And setting aside for 1 second, you're an associate professor because, of course, I mean, the things that you're going into DEI research on healthcare management in the workplace. You're doing your research on mental health literacy and how that helps job performance. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because that's very interesting. You know, everyone talks the importance of mental health, but it's fascinating to, you know, when you've actually started to study it, how much other individuals don't actually go into it, don't look into it. They classify it as important, but they stop at step one is what it seems like. And so I wanted you to tell me, if you could help me understand better, what is the connection and how does it affect the job performance?
I'll be forthcoming. I had some struggles in my own right between my transition in the military to recent years with some mental health ailments. And I found that a lot of it revolved around the transitional door, you know, the in and out of employment, you know, the finding the right fit, the understanding of one's environment, and again, that self-actualization that we talked about. You know, we wear a uniform for whatever period that we do, but we create an aura, an onus of oneself that is military. You know, we're called veterans for a reason. We're not prior military. We're veterans. We served, you know, and it is part of us, and it always will be. The way we wear our haircuts, even if we add a beard to it, you know, some go the far length of growing it down past their shoulders. I did that for a little while. My doctoral cohort will tell you I had a ponytail for a little bit, you know, fresh out of uniform. So, you know, realizing that one's body and mind is going through transition really is something that highlighted for me the need to identify those translational and transactional aspects of workplace stigma. You know, how much of us are calling upon mental health needs and calling upon mental health resources within the workplace? You know, the answer is not many. And I'm working with Dr. Trina Clayow of an organization called Give an Hour on this particular project. And Trina's organization is doing some great things right now. They've got a handbook that's out there for workplace stigma, you know, working with a handful of different organizations that are doing research in the field. So the VA is doing this, of course, but a lot of it comes from these types of private research and institutional research, and then it gets fed to the VA or fed up through congressional testimony, those types of things. So we really hope that the findings are going to suggest that reducing stigma and improving mental health literacy will significantly affect mental health for the veteran. Again, it's just going to be a survey study. It's through some validated scales that are historic, but it's on a topic that, like you said, many people aren't talking about. It's kind of in the shadows, and it'll come to light when people need it, but when you need it, it's too late.
No, absolutely. I know that stress is one of the most foundational problems that any business has because, you know, if it's the wrong kind of stress or it's too frequent, you know, if you have acute stress, well, that comes and goes. But if you have frequent acute stress or it's chronic at this point, you know, it undermines, I guess, the position of a lot of supervisors that are under the impression that you stress is the way that they should go, which is that good stress, the one that makes you productive, makes you, you know, turn from a piece of coal into a diamond. The problem is that they do it with such frequency or such intensity, they end up breaking the piece of coal. And so I wanted to know from your perspective, seeing that, you know, you're obviously an expert in this subject. How do you know when it's not the right fit? How do you know when this is not right? This is not the right kind of stress, or it's not the right kind of environment, or it's toxic, or whatever the wording you want to use. How do you know when it's not right?
I'll bring it back to one of my favorite leaders in America, Colin Powell. You know, when Colin Powell made his final speech, it went something along the lines of, you know, I wake up every morning and I no longer find myself able to strap my boots on tight and face the world the way I used to. And it goes back to that analogy that I gave about, you know, taking black eyes and then, you know, having a smile. When you can't do that anymore, when it's difficult to care about what you're doing. And when I say care, I'm not talking about going through the motions of going to work. You know, people, generally speaking, are wired to systematically perform after about 16 weeks of doing anything. You know, you can keep habits. So the habit of going to work and punching the clock and doing your daily activities is not what I'm speaking about. What I'm speaking about is having that motivation to do the extras, be part of the committees, or, be part of a mentor-mentee program, or find yourself reaching out to the community and really pushing whatever it is you do, be it a service or a product. When you don't find yourself doing that any longer, and it's hard to roll out of bed and get dressed and go do that, that's when it's time to find something else, quite frankly. And I feel too many people today don't know what we talked about earlier, which is where they want to be. Where do they want to go? What really wakes them up in the morning and gets them going? And when you can find that passion, and when you can have, that global mindset and that positive aspect in life, I think that's really, when you're succeeding. And it doesn't have to be a six-figure job. It doesn't have to be $500,000 or more. It may be just that $70,000 job, but it makes you happy, and you're happy every day. And if that's the case, then you're doing the right things.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end this episode. Dr. Scott Phillips, I so appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience and knowledge with us. I'm definitely going to want to bring you back, because I have like 30 more questions to go. And I just feel like I never have enough time with our guests.
Well, I would love to come back, Alex, anytime. I really appreciate the opportunity to just share a little about my story. It's not the story, but it's a story, and I'll stick to it.
Well, I love your story. Thank you, Dr. Phillips. I want to thank you, our audience, for tuning in, whether now or later in a recorded fashion. And finally, I want to remind everybody that next week, we will be having as our special guest, Dr. Maribel Diz. She is a senior vice president with Visa, and she's a subject matter expert in all things human resources. So you'll definitely want to stay tuned for that. In the meantime, I wish you all well. And as always, keep your finger on the pulse. Thank you, everybody. Take care.